Alright, good afternoon, kiddos. Sorry I'm out today, but this is a lecture that was given yesterday that helps you prepare for the investigation that'll take you from exponents to logarithms. So before you go do the investigation in 5.2.1, question number 55, you have to understand what an inverse is. So take a look at what's here written on the board yesterday. Actually, it still might be on the board. What you're going to do is take your original equation. Oh, it's not there on this picture, but the original equation is, can I write it? I don't have a stylus, so I got to use my finger. The original equation is y equals 3x plus 2. Wow, so ghetto. So that's the original equation. That's your OG, y equals 3x plus 2. To find what we need, which is called the inverse, your first step is to switch the x and the y. So you get x equals 3y plus 2. So that's step one. Just switch the x and the y for whatever equation that you have. And then your next step is solve for y. So in this case, you subtract your 2, and then you divide by 3, and you get this equation here, y equals 1/3 x minus 2/3. So hopefully you see that x minus 3, or x over 3 is the same as 1/3 x. And why we do that is just so it looks similar to y equals mx plus b. Now I flip that over. I just switch sides and put y equals 1/3 x minus 2/3. That's the inverse. So to notate the inverse, you put that -1 kind of like an exponent. It's not an exponent. I know it's funky because we've just been studying negative numbers as exponents, but that y to the -1 is actually just the symbol for the term inverse. So you could write that as the inverse. That's y inverse is equal to 1/3 x minus 2/3. Or it can also be written as f inverse of x equals 1/3 x minus 2/3. So those are the two ways that you can write the inverse. But those are the steps to find the inverse. You switch the x and the y, and then you solve for your y. So this new equation is its inverse. Now the inverse is not the opposite of the OG. It is a different relationship. It's kind of like the undoing of it. So it's very different than an opposite. Now, on the left over here, if you notice, I wrote this for the other class. Again, y to the -1 is equal to inverse. Y to the -1 is not what we're thinking about in terms of negative exponents, where it becomes 1 over y. So just remember that. That's just a label. It's not a part of the numbers in the equation. All right, we've looked at the equation. Now we're going to look at two other faces. Hold on. Let me add that. Bam. So now, it's hard to see because I had this on a PowerPoint and I was writing over the PowerPoint. But let's add the graph. I am going to draw. Now let's see, what am I going to draw? I'm going to draw the Cartesian coordinate plane. Right here. X-axis. Y-axis. Now this is really hard to see from this vantage point, but I'm going to try to explain this. So if you graph the OG here, and you graph the inverse here, so we plot those points, we draw those two lines. The interesting thing that happens for an inverse is that the original line and the inverse are mirrors of each other across this y equals x line. So that y equals x cuts that plane in half, and all inverses will always reflect the OG. So if you look at this part here, called blue, look at that, it gets reflected across that dotted line over here. And the bottom part, this part, gets reflected across the dotted line, whoops, over there. So the graphs will always be reflections of each other, and you guys are going to do that in investigation. Graph the inverse and see how it how the reflection will look. Now over here to the right, over here is an example. If this is your original, what should the inverse look like? Yep, gets reflected over the dotted line. There's the inverse right on the other side. In this case, it's parallel versus crossing and intersecting. Alright, now the table, which we don't use that much but is an interesting concept. Here's the table for the OG. Now look at the table for the inverse and see if you notice any patterns. So take a look at that. If you look at the X column in the OG, you'll notice that it becomes your Y column or Y inverse column in the inverse, and so like that. And then the Y in the OG becomes the X in the inverse. So all the points, if you plot, if you have a table, they just switch. Sorry, again, I don't have a stylus, so I'm just using my finger. They switch over, they just switch places. So if you ever had the table, switch them, boom, you got your points for your inverse, and you could graph it like that. So these are three things that happen with an inverse. So this is planting the seeds for our logarithm unit, and is also planting the seeds for discussions you'll have in pre-calc, especially the trigonometry part next year. You'll see, you've talked about cosine and sine, you'll talk about inverse cosine, inverse sine. So this talk about inverses is introducing this new topic. So you know three phases now: the equation, the graph, and the table. Alright, so now head into section 5.2.1 in CPM, do the investigation for question 55. Yes, okay, and then the homework was there up on Edmodo. Alright, hope you have a good weekend. Take care. Bye. And get ready for your midterm. Bye.